MP Vandenbeld, please.
I want to thank you very much, Mr. Genuis, for putting this incredibly important bill forward, and others before you, Mr. Wisniewski and others. And I'd just like to reassure you that we absolutely support. I have 100% support for what you are doing. It is a long time coming. I think that organ trafficking, illegal organ trafficking, is probably one of the vilest and most inhumane, worst forms of trafficking and of crimes that are happening internationally. And Canada should be leading the world in this regard. And we also share your urgency in terms of the need to make sure that we get legislation passed on this. So I would just like to ask you, in terms of the international community, we know in the Subcommittee on Human Rights, we heard from Uyghur testimony that said that they're being asked for DNA samples, which raises a very dark specter of why are they being asked for DNA samples. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime is saying that armed groups and terrorist groups are now using trafficking, including organ trafficking, as a means of funding their terrorist activities. No Canadian, I believe, would ever want to receive an organ from somebody where the person was either murdered or was extorted or coerced. I think this is something we all know is absolutely wrong. So could you tell the committee what are the trends internationally? Is this a problem that is increasing? Is this a problem that is getting worse? Is it spreading? What are the international trends?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for your question, for your support, Ms. Vandenbeld, and I found where I was looking at my notes, and it fits well within your question to say that countries that have passed similar legislation, I mentioned Israel, Spain, and Taiwan, but also Italy and Norway. So some other examples to look at in terms of similar legislation being enacted. And you know, I think you outlined very well in your comments what the international trends are. What we see with China is sophisticated, well-organized abuse of human rights, and I think it's sort of a stereotype in our language that is false, where we tend to associate technological development, so-called civilization, with moral improvement. Those things do not go together in any sort of automatic sense at all, right? So when we look at China, we see the systematization of gross violation of human rights. I know the parliamentary secretary who's here and I have the honor of working together on the Canada-Tibet Parliamentary Friendship Group. So he's very aware of that in that context. I know as well as in other contexts in China. You mentioned the situation with Uyghurs, the collection of DNA samples. So there's a lot. At the same time as we see this going on, of course, these things aren't sort of publicly advertised in terms of exactly what they're doing, right? It does take the detailed work of people like David Matas and David Kilgore to unearth it. The link to terrorist financing, all of these things are emerging and growing problems, and they are part of what I referred to earlier in response to Mr. Wisniewski's question, the changing impacts of injustice in an interconnected world, and we need to do all we can to make sure that we are not being in any way complicit in this. And I think your comments about terrorist financing underline, I think, another issue here, which is the security dimension of this, right? So I'm not the sort of person that thinks that everything has to be denominated in terms of security. Human rights is enough of a reason for me, right? But I think recognizing the security impacts as well of this, when you have this very strong potential revenue stream for extremist and dangerous organizations, that has an impact on our own security as well.
Okay. There are Canadians, particularly diaspora communities, who, if they need an organ, a lot of their family members are abroad, or there are dual citizens who may go to their home country where there might be things that are perfectly legal in order to get organs. Is there anything in this bill that would preclude somebody from being able to do something like that?
Great question. This bill does not in any way seek to restrict people from receiving organs from abroad if there is consent. the requirement is that they don't receive organs from abroad if there is not consent. Bill C-350, which was a bill I proposed, but it was wholly the same as a bill proposed by Irwin Cotler. It envisioned a system where somebody would bring a certificate with them attesting to that consent. I think there's some potential value in that, but there's also some complexity around assessing the validity of a certificate and countries where that just may not happen as a matter of course. So the way this legislation is set up is it would be incumbent on the prosecution to demonstrate based on a typical standard of proof that there was exploitation, that there wasn't proper consent. So does that mean that there are cases where someone might be involved in organ trafficking and it's difficult to prove? It's difficult to get a conviction. Well, yes, that's something that prosecutors deal with every day. But certainly the chances that somebody who simply innocently went abroad and received an organ for which there was consent, doing so in another jurisdiction which has the rule of law, or receiving from a family member, the risk that person would get caught up in a prosecution here is totally nil. If anything, the risk is greater the other way, that someone would do something nefarious and not get caught in a prosecution. But at least it's better to have this law than not have this law, even though we're not going to be able to successfully prosecute every case. Again, that's true of any law.